For the third and final session, never the final word, for today's workshop. I'm absolutely lucky that I'm here. I think the only thing that qualifies me to be here is my deep admiration for Calypso. That's the beginning of the interview. But I am very pleased. I feel that also in the presence of many experts, more expert than I, on many of the topics that we are discussing today, that I'm very happy to serve as a kind of catalyst conductor. So this session, there is, I understand, it had explained to me a certain logic that runs through the day, and many of the themes, of course, are overlapping. And appropriately enough, this last session we're looking towards the future. But in fact, we've been doing that. Can't say all along. I was not unfortunately able to come to the first session, but it was certainly evident in that in the session which we just had. And indeed the latest title, because I understand there's also been many kind of changes of the program. But the latest title that I've been given is Europe as a Laboratory for Tomorrow's Planetary Politics. Well, laboratory, of course, has been again theme that's been throughout the discussion that we just had. But it does pick up on a lot of other work, maybe that we haven't mentioned, that Calypso has done with regard to democracy, also with respect to planetary concerns that haven't had quite as much attention in our discussion on climate, but not only. And as I think we saw with the previous session, this will probably be very wide ranging. We have an excellent panel, as in case again, all through the day. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking, and I'll allow them to explain what they're going to be addressing rather than my attempt to second guess them. So we have first Gjovalin Macaj, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leiden, but seconded, fair to say at the moment, to the Albanian mission to the United Nations, which is currently an elected member of the UN Security Council. Not elected over non-permanent. Then we have Matthew Eagleton-Pierce, a reader in international political economy at SOAS, and rounding up the discussion would be Olivier, who is a Darendorf scholar here, currently working on his detail with Calypso. So we'll start with you, Gjovalin. You each, in view of the fact that we're fewer in number, have 10 to 12 minutes. So I'd like to kick off.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. I'm really delighted to be here, and I know I've been here for I've spent like over 10 years much with them. I still can't believe that I'm here. It's almost
not just because some people in Zoom are saying they can't hear you very well.
Yes. So it's really like a dream, and this would have remained a dream had it not been for Calypso. I would not have made it to Oxford. It's really thanks to you, and it's not metaphorical, it's real, that I'm here and I have the honor to address this panel. And I think I can speak about a condition before meeting Calypso and my condition after meeting Calypso. I remember myself.
And it went up.
Yes, again. So I remember myself in Brussels. I first met Calypso at a seminar I was not supposed to attend at the ULB, and had critical questions about the EU, but there's no receptive audience in Brussels about the question. And I asked an obnoxious question to Calypso, and then she responded, yes, I can see where you're going, but it's very hard to assess what you're saying. And it was the first time that actually opened a conversation about something that I couldn't explore in full freedom. I can recall suggestions about changing my question. It wasn't the right question to ask. Does it make sense for the European Union to speak with one voice? No, actually, the right question was, how can the European Union speak with one voice? How can it be more united and more cohesive in what it does externally? So Calypso really opened a new world for me, and I felt that I had an intellectual home, and here also that I found my intellectual home, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But today, of course, I will be speaking to Calypso's work, but I'm afraid I will do something that perhaps goes against the kind of the optimistic, upbeat vision of Europe, and speak directly to the question what we actually raised earlier, the question of utopia, but also questions of enlargement, of the answers of Europe in terms of the limits, but also what it's supposed to serve. And I will be arguing that actually what we are witnessing is a move away from universalist aspirations. It's not just the failure to meet those aspirations, but it's really a walking back of utopian aspirations. And really, what I mean by that is that we've seen, especially in recent years, we've seen a growing anxiety about the implications of universal reason and a certain fear, what I've come to call now utopophobia, drawing from connection or connecting Calypso's utopia with David Eastland's work on utopophobia, and I came up with a new neologism of it justified. It's really it's something more fundamental and more structural that we're observing today. So what I mean by this, but how I understand utopia, it's really not something that needs to be practical, even if you see that as a goal or as a method. I have more in mind Plato's idea of the ideal, like it's something that you use as a paradigm to judge where we are from where we should be, not something that can ever be realized in reality. Principles can never be realized in reality. The question is always, how do you manage the gap between where we ought to be and where we are today? And I think the great contribution of the European Union was that it actually introduced a contradiction in world politics. That you had this force that was actually promoting these universal aspirations and also showing like some kind of willingness to pursue those. And that is what has changed in my view. And again, it's still bit never fully realized. And that's of course, if we listen to Foucault when he said like there are certain utopias that there are two kinds of utopias. One kind of utopia that have the bad luck of not being realized, which is socialist utopia, and the one we live in, which is the capitalist utopia. It doesn't mean that we're not living in a utopia today. It's a dystopia for many. But what I have in mind in terms of the European Union is a kind of aspiration to actually be what it says it wants to be, like a transformative power, not to embrace the environment in which it has to operate. And here, I'm not going to talk about the recent infatuation with realpolitik and geopolitics. It has become like a new fact. And it's so depressing because Europe was supposed to be a radical break with all this 19th century realpolitik, and we've gone back to that kind of rhetoric and see it as a solution to what actually created this cataclysmic war in Europe and necessitated the EU to overcome it. So we see this, in the public discourse, we see it in the academic discourse increasingly, and of course, you don't need to be a genius to see what the implications are. If you are talking about realpolitik, there is no space for law. There is no space for principles. You're talking about excuse me, you are talking about a giant Security Council. That's what you're talking about. And there is no space for the European Union, because the European Union exists to the extent that states transcend their narrow nationalist, mercantilist policies. So, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not even going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the death of multiculturalism. There were certain politicians in Europe who took pride in saying multiculturalism is dead. How do you say that in German? Of course, multiculturalism is a fact. It cannot be denied. But what we have done is we have removed the legitimacy to multiculturalism, and we are moving more toward ethno-nationalist conceptions of citizenship and greater assimilation and homogenization. That's happening in Europe. Of course, Europe is very open to itself usually, but it's not open for certain categories. And of course, I'm not be talking about the normalization of fascism, or to call it more in correct terms, the far right, and how that permeates and shapes politics. And I'm not even talking about scary figures from IHEID, but even if you look at a good old liberal like Mark Rutte, so basically, when you see him and when he campaigns, he's basically competing with neo-Nazis about how they will reduce asylum seekers to zero. So for kind of old people who have studied the Soviet Union, it looks like a kind of a Stakhanovite, like a fascist Stakhanovite. So he wants to beat the far right at their own game. And we're talking about liberals. So liberals have a history of being Nazi neighbors, but these are the people that pass for liberals in Europe. And that's the kind of liberal we have. So, but I will not be talking about it. So, what I'll really be talking about is the two fundamental policies that we talked about, which is one is migration, because how we deal with others really says a lot about us rather than about the others, how we treat them, and enlargement. Because here we need to look at critical cases to see whether this normative talk has any purchase or not. We need to look at hard cases. And of course, if I start with migration is a direct result of the state system. We have refugees because we have states. The refugees were created because we have the creation of states. That's not the problem of the European Union. The European Union didn't create this, it inherited this problem. The question is whether the European Union is actually exacerbating the problem or it's trying to overcome it and find a solution, a decent solution for this problem. So we have the sovereignty understanding, the Saudis understanding of refugee protection, which means that it's a sovereign decision to decide who you let in and who you don't let in. But then we have the cosmopolitan idea that, well, it's not just citizens, we also have human beings that we have recognized, and these people have certain rights. They don't have citizenship, right? These are kind of the category in between. So we have this tension, and it's ongoing, it's perennial, it will never go away as long as we have the state citizens we have today. But the question is, what is the European Union doing? And the European Union what the European Union is doing is really not only failing to meet the very restrictive rights that refugees have under the 51 Refugee Convention, that includes non-refoulement. Europe has created a massive ring of we can call them Wagnerites. Like basically what Russia uses with Wagner is to say, like outsourcing border management to criminal states who are basically getting money to keep refugees out and to drowning them like they did a week ago. The Greek Coastal Guard and the Frontex were completely aware of what they were doing, and they let them drown, and they watched until they were going to create this hostile environment for migrants not to come to travel to Europe. So it's basically actively promoting illegality, the community of values and the community of law that European Union is. That is one. It's actively evading accountability by creating this space, the European Union, and creating these fictions about human rights being equal everywhere, every country in Europe having the same ability to respect basic rights, despite the fact that the European Court of Human Rights has consistently said about Greece that they don't actually meet these standards. The European Union has not removed the safe country origin when it comes to Greece or to other countries. So basically, we have this space that evades accountability, evades its responsibility to protect existing. No, we're not talking about a moral altruist here. We're talking about abiding by the existing international law. And then when we talk about the aspirational aspect of the European Union being a transformative power, trying to enlarge the category of the refugee, like who qualifies to break or not, or trying to attenuate the violence that emerges from the state's the static understanding of oppression versus protection is nowhere to be seen. When we look at the EU asylum and migration policy, every time it has become more repressive. The whole point is to really keep people out rather than to make sure that they enjoy their basic rights. But this wasn't like this. Before the European Union, migrants from the Soviet Union were welcomed as heroes because they showed the failings of the Soviet Union and how great we are. But over time, actually, they have been turned into criminals. So we have actually this reverse movement and before the EU refugee and asylum policy, migrants had much more freedom to choose where to go and how to pursue their rights. So in this case, the European Union has meant a drastic reversal and denial of the rights that they had already before the European Union became a thing, and this kind of player that wanted to play a normative role in world politics. So we have prosecution, criminalization of solidarity. Also, those who help refugees now have to face trial because they are violating the law. Those in Greece, for instance, those who expose violations of norms are actually being prosecuted because you are not supposed to expose violations of basic norms. So this is the situation this is the Europe that we are kind of dealing with. Let's now shift to enlargement. The signature policy of the European Union, the most successful, transformative. Some people wrote about how the European Union was going to run the 21st century, and enlargement was the case in point. And it didn't have to be this way, but we often just mentioned how we have the 20th anniversary of the Thessaloniki Declaration of the Future of Balkans in the European Union. We've seen a circulation of elites, but these countries haven't moved closer to the European Union. That is for internal reasons, but also for the external reasons. And the external reasons on the Euro side is that they have been the process of enlargement has been stalled because of the European Union. They simply didn't believe anymore in the process, especially after the 2000 enlargement, because Turkey, as was mentioned here, was once likely a potential candidate. Today, no one even mentions Turkey as a potential candidate. What has changed? And the reason what I see is that we have actually moved away from conditionality, and we're talking about these regions as a potential area of this kind of borderland zone that needs to be kept in check, but like a zone that will not be part of the European Union. And we've seen, especially now with Ukraine, they were forgotten for almost a decade. Now that they can be a threat to the European Union, where with China and Russia becoming more active, there is this kind of frenzy trying to convince them again to believe in the process. It's too late. And this renewed interest is also for the wrong reasons, because what they have in mind is geopolitics, realpolitik, but that's again completely contrary to the spirit of conditionality that these countries need to be transformed before they join the European Union. And this is bad for the countries, the kind of countries, but this is also bad for the European Union. Bad for the countries because they have no more incentives to reform. And even if they joined, they wouldn't be really proper members. So the European Union is also problematic because they have lost their ability to change the region, these countries. And if they ever allow these countries to come in, it will be a disaster because they will not be in any way capable of upholding the values that the EU is supposed to uphold. So if I just take these two examples, the transformative power of the European Union in this region is completely it's very hard to assess, to what extent they have changed. And now we see the hijacking of these enlightenment agenda by geopolitical reasoning. And there's no better illustration than the attitude that they have taken towards the Kosovo Prime Minister Olivier. He seems to be a fool. He has taken Europeans at their word, trying to implement the rule of law. Is the only politician in Balkan who is not corrupt, who is not compromising him, and they are actually attacking him because he's not following the appeasement policy of the European Union towards Serbia, in the hope that they would take the European side. So they base a complete mixed practice of the American policy. And I don't know where this is actually going to end. But if I take these two examples in consideration without taking into account the others, the normative appeal of the European Union, the pretension to be a different kind of power, is not borne by the facts. We basically, and actually don't, what has changed is actually Europeans are much more frank about their interests, and the Balkan leaders are also much more frank about what they want and what they don't want. So we have this transactionalist interaction that had only a tenuous relationship with the formal procedures that these countries need to follow to join the European Union. And that is why I believe that we are moving away from the kind of utopia that we've been talking about, and perhaps the time when we thought that the European Union was becoming, a model for the world in the 90s, with the declarations of its universal principles, was not so much the sunrise, but the sunset of these principles. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Gjovalin. Will you promise? You when you deliver on your promise. I think it's fair to say. Okay, we'll turn now to Matthew Eagleton-Pierce, whom I mentioned, reader in international political economy, and again, I'll leave it to you, Matt, and explain your contribution. And you have 5 minutes.
Okay, so once again, it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this workshop and this dialogue celebrating Calypso's Oxford years. I was an MPhil student, and then I stayed on to do the DPhil from 04 to 08. And on the subject, I think just before I go into some of the notes, I think I just wanted to dwell upon the issue of anecdotes. And so the first one I had was when I gave my dad Calypso's name as my supervisor to be for my MPhil. And my dad did a quick Google search, and he said to me, she's probably going to be a challenging person. Okay. I don't know if challenge was some English kind of packed in there or something else, but anyhow. Yeah. But anyhow, it's so get ready and everything. And it's not hard to come up with praise for Calypso's teaching and its guidance. There's countless elements I've tried myself to incorporate into my own practices, not to your levels, Calypso. It's been noted before in terms like the intellectual eclecticism across empirics and theory, the extremely welcoming, generous spirit, collaboration and networking that everyone is appreciative of, the capacity to navigate between academic and policy audiences, the time and rigor spent on drafts and essays, and also the frenetic emailing. I don't know if people who've had Calypso look at a draft of a document. It tends to work like this, that she will isolate the macro issues, complements, and problems, and you'll think that you're moving naturally towards the conclusion point, that feeling that the conversation is beginning to wind up. no, the conversation doesn't wind up. We go back to the top again and we start the inflection process all over again in this kind of elliptical manner. Okay, so and I can't, on this, I can't forget possibly the 3-hour seminars on IPD in this room. I mean, 3 hours, it's normal for Paris, I'm not sure, elsewhere. But I think I just wanted to say that the best thing with Phillips was about six weeks before I was due to submit my DPhil, and she said to me in a very calm tone that I don't think you have an argument here. Could it be a better blow to the stomach? But what I think she meant was that the argument was buried, and it had to be brought. I think
It was there.
Yeah, so those are some thoughts. Okay. I wanted to just inspired by a couple of areas of Calypso's work under this theme, we're kind of trying to link to the how the panel's been framed. One is on the political economy of global trade, and the other is a more diffuse thing about understanding temporality. And we've already been getting into grips with this in relationship to the EU already. So the first thing is that my research grew out of a focus on the political economy of global trade, and I'm sure Calypso has conducted a number of inquiries in this area, many centered on EU politics. And I'd like to pick up on the question of is trade good and a force for good. So global trade ethics, which is your work with Rob Howes, refers to a set of ethical rather than legal principles that ought to inspire actors involved in addressing conflicts in the realm of trade. For those of you who haven't touched upon this arguments they have here, they make a subtle cosmopolitan pluralist argument. It comes out of the debates on subsidiarity in the EU from the 1990s, among other sources. And it's not a naive prescription to engineer a particular set of policies or rules. Rather, it's what I appreciate about that, the conversation you were ensuing there, was how the normative points come out of a concrete assessment of the empirical problems, and those were at the time the empirical problems of the WTO and the wider liberal trade project. Okay, so how is participation and inclusiveness to be widened beyond the insider expert technocratic groups, something which is relevant for trade, but many other fields? How is it possible if democratic politics is blocked or is non-existent at the domestic level in many cases? So I think that what Rob in self-do Calypso is helped to clarify such problems, and you call for the difficult process, difficult for the insiders, for the authoritarian impulses that they often have, to try to welcome different agents and different values which are not in their instinctive menu, and also expand the scope for compensation for those who are consistent losers, among other key arguments. So I think that there's always space very much for these types of arguments. I mean, and I softened to this argument over time. As you try to thread the eye of the needle on some of these troubled tensions. That said, if I was to have a comeback to some of this, this global trade ethics argument, it would probably be summed up with the question of, does this argument contain or allude to all the forms of power that are working to reproduce the trade policy world in its current forms? And one thing I would say is right for further inspection always is the role of corporate power and corporate lobbying in this. Now, this you did this in your fantastic work on the services rise of services as a trade, form of trade. But I think it's like, if you're applying global trade ethics to look at some of the vex issues now, you can examine a number of different illustrations, but digital trade, for instance, has seen as is commonly recognized, an aggressive consolidation of big tech power. Okay, the EU has been playing catch up in this game vis-a-vis the US and China, but is also implicated in the reproduction of the surveillance capitalists of Silicon Valley. So it's kind of like how does global trade ethics either chime or clash with some of these extractive data politics, which is the stuff which is being fought over now? How to process and sell algorithmic explanations of human behavior, and it's a big question mark over the extent to which the EU is considerably different from what the likes of the US are pursuing. The final remark I think is provoked a bit by the panel title on Europe as a lab for the future, and this is kind of left it's a more of a mishmash of things, but also connecting with conversations so far. And this is how we can think about temporality, or more precisely, multiple temporalities, because it looks like your work has got multiple temporalities going on often all the time, in terms of delving in terms of historical record or genealogy of ideas, what is the current problems and structures of the day, and how we can plot normatively more appealing features. It hasn't been mentioned yet, it's out there in the corridor there, but the book you edited, co-edited on Echoes of Empire, I thought was a really good volume. And it was trying to grapple with the legacy of the European imperialism and all the sorts of after effects, both obvious and indirect and subtle. And I don't have any answers to this area in particular, but all I would say is trying to become more comfortable juggling multiple temporalities in the same analytical mood sometimes. So to think about a model for Europe implies that you have probed or tried to probe all the messy multiple traditions in which Europe has come through, which includes, to paraphrase Marx on Capital, a reality which is dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. Okay. And it was also here that I was saying, let's make the connection. The final point I want to raise is on humility, okay? Because I also have this, and other people have also raised it as well. And it's if you were to have a sense of humility, it would mean that you would acknowledge that others have a right to protest, a right to look away, maybe and not agree, not implement, your ideas and thoughts. But I agree with what you were saying just on the last panel, is that to be humble, involves a social aspect. You are reflexive, you're trying to learn, you're trying to apologize and so forth. In some respects, that's the easiest part of being humble, that learning process. The hard part is paying your debts that you have accrued as is judged by others, okay? So I think this is part of the difficulty of handling the idea of multiple temporalities, because it is implying that there's many interpretations and experiences of past history, and this will shape what is selected and the scope for action.
Something which I don't think that we used to have heard in previous sessions, and I remember about this morning, but thank you for that. So we'll conclude introductory remarks with Olivier.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have three main points. My first point is on reversing the gaze. My second point is on Europe as a laboratory as well. And my third point is more specifically about Europe as a laboratory for planetary politics and what I want to call grassroots geopolitics. Bear with me, my first point is slightly longer than my two others. It's about reversing the gaze as three types of practices: a geopolitical practice, a philosophical practice, and an ecological practice. Now, I want to, as a homage to Calypso, who loves to experiment with kind of innovative and immersive methods of teaching, I wanted to, because we're actually talking about reversing the gaze, it's not just kind of academic lingo, it's actually also something that's got to do with perception. I thought I'd bring some visual cues. The first one I brought is actually one that maybe Timothy and Paul might remember. I brought to the first meeting we had on the Europe in the Changing World project, where we were basically trying to reverse the gaze. It's a drawing by Saul Steinberg, if any of you know him, that's in the New Yorker. It's one of it's probably his most famous drawing, and it's a New Yorker cover. It's called The View from Manhattan, the view of the world from Manhattan. And so essentially it starts here on 9th Avenue, which is basically the center of the world, of all the, your spatial coordinates. And it goes from there to the 10th Avenue, which is at one remove, the Hudson River, Jersey, Kansas City, Las Vegas, Mexico and Canada are the two blind spots that are on the side. The Pacific Ocean is just one tiny strip of white. And then all the way in the distance, you have three kind of slithers of land. The first is China, second is Japan, the third is Russia. And actually two of these countries we study in the Europe in the Changing World program. So that's a representation of when basically you look at Europe or the West more broadly, looks at the world from the inside out. Now, this is very limiting.
You want us to pass it down?
This is very limiting insofar as identity, as you know, is a mix of how we perceive the world and how the world perceives us. And there's quite a moving passage. Timothy, I hope you won't mind me quoting it because it's in your book about your mother. And you say that she happily recalled some romantic months spent as a young woman in New Delhi at the end of the Second World War. And she'd go out riding early in the morning. And the only time your mother ever referred to herself as a European was when she reminisced about her youth in British ruled India, where she was born a daughter of the Raj. Only, and you argue that in India, the English call themselves European. Only back home do they still often like to deny a truth that seems self-evident to anyone looking at them from Washington, Beijing, Siberia, or Tasmania. And so the idea of like reversing that kind of that geopolitical gaze is something that's quite, I think, healthy geopolitical practice. It kind of vaccinates you against some of the main tenets of the disciplines of international relations, which is very heavy on looking at the world in analyzing nation states from the top down and from the inside out. And what we did during this Europe in the Changing World program is speak to Chinese students and faculty during COVID, speak to Russian students and faculty during the Russian war in the Ukraine. And so you have a kind of tangible relationship with, if you like, conflicting, or I think for Salvador, called conflicting modernity, alternative world, alternative worldviews, which is very tangible because it's dialogical, because you're talking to people across these different time periods. So I think reversing the gaze, firstly, is healthy geopolitical practice. I think it's also a healthy philosophical practice. What I've taken here as a visual cue to illustrate it is an envelope from one of the countries you can see in the Steinberg illustration, which is from Japan, which one of my housemates, who's a violinist, gave me, and a Japanese composer sent her some pieces in this envelope. Now, I don't speak any Japanese, but I'm told by her that essentially this is the Tokyo postcode up here. And then what it says here is Minatoku Atago 132, which is basically the equivalent of Islington, Angel, and then the postcode, right? And then Atago Biu, which is the name of the building and the number of your apartment building. In other words, what you're doing here in the Japanese custom is you start from the outside. You're starting from your region and you walk back into your locality, your neighborhood, your postcode, your building, and your apartment flat within your building, which is exactly the opposite of obviously what we do in most countries in Europe. And I think there's a French scholar called Gilles Deleuze used this as a philosophical metaphor. He said, well, there are two ways of looking at the world. Either you start from the individual and you as a kind of basis, and then you move outwards, or you move outwards towards the horizon. Basically, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it's from the individual to the horizon, or you go from the horizon to the individual. And I think if you actually look at anybody walking in a metropolis today, walking around with their nose on their phones, essentially optimizing their own sort of individual comfort, the individual as the beginning and end all of all things, right? Your own, you're maximizing the utility of the individual. You're optimizing your comfort, increments of comfort. You're enhancing your well-being or your wellness. And that's the basic unit of analysis. And then you go out from there. I think it's still quite relevant, perhaps even more relevant today when you see these self-contained units with their headphones just walking around. But we have to, it's healthy philosophical practice to reclaim the horizon, where you're reclaiming the horizon. You're starting from the horizon image. I also want to say that reversing the gaze is also an ecological practice. When we had the Darendorf colloquium a couple of months ago, we were basically arguing about whether you should use socialism and capitalism as political lenses to analyze the ecological issue, right? You could also see things the other way around. You could see that you were using the 20th century political lens to analyze the 21st century problem. So if you turn things around and actually use the state of the habitability of the planet to refashion our political lenses for the 21st century, this might be one of the kind of ways in which we can be a laboratory for future planetary politics. I have my visual cue for this is, unfortunately, I can't really produce it because it's basically apocryphal, it doesn't actually exist, which I realized when we were in an airport in Italy and our plane was late with Adele, Ernest, and Timothy, and Timothy asked me, well, we've been working on like formative moments of young people for years now, and I've never asked you what your formative moment is. And I said, well, I don't really know. And he said, tell me, don't think about it, tell me. And I told him about this. The thing that sprang to mind was when I was at some point I needed to write a book and I couldn't find any peace and quiet. So I was on this kind of container ship for a couple of months, which left from Europe and went through the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Indian Ocean. And we arrived in the Indian Ocean, and bear in mind it's like, basically you take the Eiffel Tower, you put it on the water, and it's 14 stories high. So it's like 4 Hildebrand buildings. Right? So, and at the top you've got the captain's, the captain's berth. And he once invited me up there, and we were in the Indian Ocean. We were ringed by the flat horizon only, as T.S. Eliot would say. There was nothing, no ships, no land, nothing. And I saw, or I thought I saw, the curvature of the earth. Right? And I was immensely sort of touched and emotional about this. It took me ages to get back to Europe, and it's only when I got back to Europe that I figured out that this was completely impossible, because 80 meters high, you can't see the curvature of the earth. But what was important is the perception that I had thought that I'd seen the curvature of the earth. It was in a way my kind of Carl Sagan pale blue dot moment. It's like not just seeing the world from the horizon in, but actually seeing the world from the planet in. So I do have like at least one visual cue, which is the Carl Sagan. This is the original picture from the 14th of February 1990, where Voyager took a picture of the Earth from basically Neptune, from 6 billion miles away. And you can't really see it here, but there's a vacillating, sort of scintillating pixel that I might be able to zoom in on, that's just caught in a ray of sunlight, and that's us, that's our home, that's the Earth, right? So yeah, so that was my, if you like, the moment where it was, if you push the logic all the way to seeing the world from the outside in, it actually you touch at some point the Carl Sagan moment. But anyway, my point is that in terms of planetary politics, I won't dwell too much on this, but the geopolitics of nature today in the 21st century changed, I think, the nature of geopolitics. So the geopolitics of nature changed the nature of geopolitics. Our extractive, exploitative relationship to the natural world is something that has fashioned our politics, and we can only refashion our politics if we refashion our relationships to how we inhabit the planet. We have to ask what happens if the international system is not protecting the interests of the Earth system. What happens politically and geopolitically then? And in my opinion, we're just at the very, very, very beginning of this meeting. So my two next points are quite short, so I apologize for being a bit long on the first one. I do think Europe has a great capacity for being this laboratory for future global planetary politics. In a way, Europe has always been this laboratory for political and geopolitical thinking. If you look at early modern Europe, if you look at if you want one space, one territory, you always have these kind of overlapping sovereignties, right? You have your feudal lord, you have your king, you have the Pope. So on one single territory, you have these overlapping sovereignties, and I think, in a way, postmodern Europe is kind of the same. This device was given to me by my late uncle, so I was happy, and I had to go to the Apple store in London, and they told me there's nothing we can do because we need your Apple ID, and it's not yours. So it took me about 6 months to work it out, and I figured out that I could probably do fewer things without my ID than without my passport. And so Apple had more of a hold or more of a sovereignty on me than basically the state that I inhabited. It's something that also Hartmut Meyer says often, that basically in every tangible aspect of your life in Europe has an external dimension to it. So what's in your phone, semiconductors, protective equipment, everything has an external dimension to it, and you can't deny that these overlapping layers of sovereignty sometimes come from the outside. We have to coexist. The laboratory, as Calypso says, fails more often than it succeeds, and Europe has certainly very often failed, but at least it's always interesting, and I think Europe is in a good position to be a laboratory for these planetary politics. As we say in our report, young Europeans speak to the EU about Europe. Europe might and should seek to reunite and reconcile protection of the environment, protection of its citizens, the protection of the European project. There are three dimensions which are not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. My last point, my third point, more specifically about what I want to call grassroots geopolitics, I think there are two dimensions to it. The first is Calypso's democratic geopolitics, like geopolitics from the point of view of the citizen power Europe. What is the lived experience and lived experiences of geopolitics? How do we actually tangibly experience geopolitics in our everyday lives? But I think also if you put the sort of grassroots in that kind of social sense of grassroots, right? But also if you add the ecological challenge to it and put it at the very heart of the 21st century, not at the periphery of your political lenses, then I think that's the broad umbrella under which at least I'm trying to place the work that I'm going to do in the next few years. Basically, the study of the political processes through which policies are shaped in relational terms across social and ecological boundaries. So that's it. Just trying to tie together a number of threads that we've been talking about today. Instead of talking about geopolitics from the inside out and from the top down, I'm trying to do it from the bottom up and the outside in. Thank you. Sorry for being kind.
Well, three very eloquent presentations and testaments really to your inspiration. And so in many respects, started with a cautionary note about optimism, ended with a caveated observation about your potential as a laboratory, more optimistic. I know we don't have that much time, and I want to have time also for calypso at the end. So I think, we'll open immediately with comments and questions from the floor and then, reactions, and then I don't know, Calypso, if you want to bring up the rear with some, summary observations. But starting, with Yuri.
Yeah, thank you. I have two very, very quick questions one for Gjovalin and one for Olivier. So on utopophobia, I took this to be a complaint about theorizing loosely. So at least in the way you mentioned Estland, right? And there is a worry about that we make our theories too much dependent on the facts. But I think you're turning this in a kind of wider form of criticism. So I was trying to understand, do you think, is it the practice that has become too anti-utopian, or you think that's also true of the theorizing? You'd be interested to hear more where you think it's going. And for Olivier, I wondered, reversing the gaze, right? It seems this can be quite this debilitating as well. So if you think about, you make yourself in a way dependent on other people's view of you, and that can be very problematic. Imagine somebody from Africa reversing the gaze, right? So they will look at themselves in terms of the stereotypes that other people have. That might be the actual opposite of liberating or thinking about yourself, how you should be and what you should be. So I wonder, is reversing the gaze only something we want to a measured degree, or is it something that we want only for the powerful? Or what's the right balance between reversing and not reversing the gaze, and refusing to reverse the gaze, as it were, to other people's stereotypes about us?
I think a couple more and then.
Okay, thank you. Excellent panel again. Now, Olivier, you got me thinking whether we got the right map at the European Study Center. For years, we've been discussing that it was, too narrow in terms of where the borders are. And then we brought the bigger map, which included Ukraine and Turkey. And that was very significant also because in itself, it did denote how we perceive the center periphery as well, because the bigger the map, Poland becomes, the center, the UK and France become the side, that is interesting, I think. But maybe we have to reconsider also how we see Europe, and also, whether we put the map upside down or and so on and so forth. But one comment I wanted to make about Gjovalin, that I don't exactly share your complete pessimism about the EU, because there is something attractive about the continent as well that brings migrants in the European continent. And I believe for the EU and its planetary image, the issue of migration is definitely something particularly significant for the EU to project the right image. Because what's happening now is definitely working within the borders, maybe, enlarge them as well and bring in Ukrainians that are much more welcome, etc. But what you do with the others, and this subhumanization of migrants, the two categories, is, I still believe, part of this post-imperial, post-colonial disease that Europe still has hangover of it. But I wouldn't share completely your pessimism. I believe you should try to, assess what you got positive there, and then try to make it better.
Yes, goodbye.
Sure, I want to follow up actually on Yuri's comment. So question to Olivier, on your second point, the philosophical reversing of the gaze, as it were, from the individual to the horizon and back. Is the individual in some ways a stand-in for a particularistic view of the world, and the horizon stands for the universal? And you're advocating to put the universal and the universalist ambition front and center once again at the cost of particularism. I guess my challenge is, and I wonder what you have to say about this, that in order to understand contemporary politics, we really need to understand not so much the universal, but we need to understand the particularist much better, and the reason for why people are so drawn towards it. Do you agree or disagree?
Okay, and all three feel free to respond. Maybe starting with you, Caplan?
Yeah, excellent question. I think it's a longer discussion, but to me, what we need is to accept reality for what it is rather than trying to change it to meet the demand and standard. And in my case, what is really problematic is not so much the practice is always efficient, but it's actually the normalization of Europe and the loss of its distinctive nature by actually embracing especially now, the parliament, the geopolitical realpolitik discourse. We have Borrell, we talked about relearning the language of power, and he thinks that's a good idea. So that's to me telling of this shift in the universalist features of the European Union. It's kind of a fear of what comes from that, of the consequences of having this kind of difficulty. I think it's that's how I see it, and we can discuss it further. And often I think we agree with the dehumanization of the other. There is a racial element to it, as we see today, how much attention is paid to one strategy, 4 people died, and I haven't actually followed, and nearly 700. And you see which one gets more attention. So that's really telling. I think I'm more pessimistic about than you, not because, especially if you look at not because the current leaders are not delivering and they're very interested in doing so and they're not connected. But I'm more pessimistic because the European Union is no longer committed to the kind of formal criteria of enlargement. The demanding the institutionalization of the FP seems to be like something that can be negotiated about. We see I have nothing to quote. I'm always favor of Ukraine and Jordan and all about intention. We see this kind of corners. And if you undermine and differential treatment despite lack of progress, if you undermine the credibility of the group, then you're going to base your assessment on arbitrary criteria, which depend on momentary considerations of interest and momentary prevailing norms of the community. That means you render accession arbitrary and you remove the fundamental idea behind it, because that should be the paragon of consistent application of rule of law. And Balkan leaders will read more into it and say, like, of course we should pretend that we are reforming, because they are pretending. Actually, they're not even pretending. It is like it's when Borrell goes to the region, really is acting in that theory. It's like an antithesis, a fragile antithesis of the 19th century. That is how we see the Balkans. It doesn't see the Balkans as here are these norms, and if you apply it, and if you apply those norms, you will get ahead. That is not an impression that you get from each country or the general field. But it is not something that is done today. It's something that goes back in time. That's what makes me pessimistic. The transformative power of the international banking has been lost.
Anything, Matthew, to?
I have more anecdotes on Calypso.
Yeah.
But they can make I did there's one little thing that made me think about the maps is that geographers practice this mind map exercise with students and themselves, whereby you draw a certain map, certain region, on the basis of your own knowledge of that, without any guidance. And what this is, it's not only a demonstration of what you know, what you don't know about where the boundaries are, features, etc. But what it tends to do is show the politics of awareness within yourself about do you make certain actually larger than others, you do not grasp, what the relationship is between them, etc. So it's not just simply just some simple exercise of knowledge, what you know about the maps, but there's a politics there. So maybe the challenge is to get everyone in the European Study Centre to, to do some mind maps of Europe, maybe it would be interesting.
I think I'll just take a couple of sort of concrete examples to respond, because both of your questions were in a way similar. But the first example I want to take is not mine. I'm stealing it from one of the Chinese colleagues whom we were working with here in the program, called Professor Xiaolu. And he made the point once, a very convincing one, about I think he called it the perception of dual regression. And he was talking about the relationship between Europe and China. What he was saying was that China thought that Europe was regressing in terms of power, it was a declining power, and that Europe thought that China was regressing in terms of norm, it was less and less latched on to the norms of the global international community. And then he said, what the problem this causes is that it doesn't give you a direction of travel, because there's no real perception that any engagement can make this better. But I think this kind of illustrates the point of, it's kind of like a security dilemma you apply to the world of perception, essentially, right? It's, if you start from kind of your own worldview, and then you analyze the other based only on your own worldview, then you're bound to end up in a perceptive security, a security dilemma of perception, because you're bound to see the other in a non-dialogical, or what I call a non-relational way. The idea of reclaiming the horizon forces you to see the place that you hold in the broader scheme of things. Instead of viewing individuals as kind of units, instead of going with a unit-based analysis, in which essentially both individuals and nation states are just billiard balls. They never engage dialogically with each other. They just, they basically just knock against each other, and then they create an atmosphere of mistrust. And I think that's what Charlie was saying between Europe and China. You actually, if you try to go beyond this idea that individuals and nation states are just billiard balls on a billiard table, and have a more, what I would call, relational worldview, it forces you out of those individual units, and it forces you to be more dialogical. The second example I would take is the climate challenge, because in my opinion, the reason I find it interesting is it's basically the cosmopolitan worldview of the 21st century, because it's a challenge that applies across the board. It applies to China, it applies to Europe, it applies to India, obviously not equally, but it's something that applies across the board, and which therefore forces you, to an extent, it pushes you to the kind of pale blue dot threshold, right? Because it forces you out of yourself. It forces you out of yourself because it forces you to think of your place in the grand scheme of things. My intellectual hero is Spinoza, and he has a metaphor for this. It's like the blood in the body. There's a symbiotic relationship between the particular and the universal. You can't separate them. There's a symbiotic relationship between one and the other, and we often, I think, lose track of this because we have this way we erect the individual as the beginning and end of all things, and then analyze the world based on that. If you do it the other way around, you cannot see individuals as billiard balls. You have to see the underlying relationship that links individuals and nation states above, beyond, and below this kind of primary school map of that we all learn with the colored little nation states that inhabit the sphere.
Nora, can you hear us?
I can.
And it appears you've raised your hand, yes?
I have, yes. And I feel very much like Steinberg's
No.
individual.
No,
We can't hear you.
My
All right.
headphones, walking around a quaint Bay Area neighborhood, but with my. No, you now?
Now is
Can you hear me
better.
now?
Now is
No?
better.
Oh, now? Can you hear me now? Okay,
Yeah.
yes. Now's good? Okay, great. So, yeah.
Nora, I'm very sorry, but the audio.
Steinberg's painting. No. Okay, I'll put it into a question. Yes? No?
Yeah, very sorry about that. We just came
Okay,
to-
I'll write it. I'll write it into the chat
Yeah.
box. Then.
Who's monitoring
Okay.
your shit? You are. Okay, we'll have to maybe a couple more comments or questions.
Yeah.
Tim?
If I may, Olivier, fascinated by the notion of geopolitics from bottom up and outside in. And I have a very simple question. Who are the actors from bottom up or outside in, which have the power to have a significant impact on the hard-hearted world of states? Just give us a couple of examples.
We have some more questions so I can think about it.
Okay, your last point about the importance, well, I mean, dialogical has been something about your comments, but you seem to be putting emphasis on a recognition of a common fate that we share, and the elevating that, the importance of that, and even arguably the mobilizing effect that can have, transcending differences in many respects. But aren't we obscuring the questions that inevitably arise about whose responsibility, how much responsibility, both historically and the implications that has for present relations, and even contemporarily in terms of resources and gross inequalities and what that entails for
Recording in progress.
in the world. So I just wonder, do we have to be mindful of these things, and is that then do we not get stuck? I mean, I don't see, I think that's been these have been issues that have been haunting a lot of our debates, even where there has been recognition of a common fate and the need for concerted common action. Did that help you think about his question?
Yeah.
Definitely.
It was unfair.
I'll start with that one. I think it's just a question of basically what comes first. What's the most fundamental? I mean, in Xiaolu's example, what he's saying is it's not so much China's asserted behavior, China's nationalism that explains the conflict of the increasing dilemma in the conflict between China and Europe and the West. It's more lack of recognition. For him, the evidence points more to lack of recognition, lack of respect, lack of attention, lack of taking the other into account. And I think you cannot talk of the question of responsibility if you don't put that first. And I think, in my opinion, that flows, the responsibility flows from the recognition. It will never work the other way around. The Timothy's question, I'm going to slide who wants to be a millionaire. I'm going to call a member of, not a member of the audience. I'm going to call on Calypso Citizen Power Europe and Democratic Geopolitics to help me out by saying that actually it's in a way the citizens already have the power, because as we saw, I think, partly in our round of the round of polling that we did on friend and foe, ultimately, state structures, institutional structures like the EU do actually rely on what I would call, for want of a better word, the psychology, collective imagination of the people who they consider to be friends and who they consider to be foes. And that doesn't mean the state will necessarily act in accordance with that, but I do think there's a spectrum and it limits to an extent the choices that a government and the state will make because it can't act completely out of fashion with the kind of the psyche of its people. Obviously, there are counterexamples of this. We could talk about Russia at the minute. I don't know if that would be a good counterexample, but if you're giving me counterexamples, I'll just shove the questions to Clip because she'll respond much more competently than I.
Do we have Nora's question? We do not.
No, we do not. I have been faithfully
I'm-
following it. But
Oh,
it's
we have
okay.
Nora.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
She's working on it.
Come back to them.
Okay, that means that we might have time for another comment or question. No, okay, yes,
Yes, so again, I'm in probably the relatively unusual position of being an EU official here so often in the policy world, and it's been quite interesting and sometimes challenging to listen to the external opinions of the institutions I've worked in for a long time. And so from Brussels' perspective, we are always aware of competences, and the EU has been assigned tasks to do. And we're at a point where huge new tasks are being kind of suggested or under discussion for the European Union, tasks which have been and are member state competences. On one level, security. It's fine where the EU can help make an additional contribution. I really think there's kind of limitations to what suddenly the EU can do things that the US, the UK, France, NATO, and several member states can't do. So I'm not quite sure what the added value is, but I can understand that it's there. It's a matter for discussion. But there's another aspect, and that is the fragility of societies and the vulnerability of the increased vulnerability of those left behind through greater inequality. This is also a member state issue, social policy, and there's kind of much less discussion of encouraging the European Union to push more into this area. So we have an unbalanced discussion where please get involved in the security side, which is a member state issue that you need to step up. And then on the other hand, the social issue is just there, not much anyone can do about it. And the problem is that this fragmentation, social fragmentation and polarization is a huge risk both to the future of European integration and indeed to Europe's ability to stand together on a subject like Ukraine. So my question is really, where are what are the prospects of more movement towards the social dimension of Europe emerging as a corollary of the other dimensions that are under discussion?
anyone want to take a shot at that? John? I'm tempted to say you have the answer.
You're sending it back to me.
Well, no, but if you have an intuition.
I mean, I think that, again, if I look forward 1 year, there's a European Parliament election. I think the outcome of that election will set parameters, because the people we elect in the European Parliament are the people who, endorse particular courses. So I think it's kind of important to think about that.
Any other thoughts?
Sure.
Oh, Nora, if you can hear us, please mute your microphone. Mute your microphone, please, Nora. And no words from the chat. Any reflection on what you've just heard, or okay, I'm also conscious of time. And if we don't have Nora's comment clip, so I don't know whether you'd like to take this opportunity then to say a few words with respect to what you've heard in this session, but perhaps also more broadly.
A few words, you know me, Richard. And I just picked up Nora's question, but Nora, I'll pick it up in a moment. Let me just say, Nora, that your intermittent, intervention from across the world, I think is a kind of wonderful metaphor for our intense desire for togetherness and how damn hard it is. That's where Hobbesian Leviathan came from, this ontological skepticism he had about our capacity to think together. But yet, I think we've proven Hobbes wrong. And Olivier, you spoke of the relational worldview that you and I share with others in this room. And I think it connects us in this room, our stories, our journeys, as well as how we see the world. I was going to say the real world, but how real is it really? And so, I just want to start with feelings and then say something about the threads of our conversation. And I hadn't prepared anything, but I picked up those threads connecting to where we are all going somehow in this journey. But, it is about feelings. And Tim Blandas, I don't know if he's still here in the room. There you go. He's the only other freak in this room, French freak, so I have to cite him first. And he said, Philippe, so this is as close to immortality as you can get. So you're right, Tim. And there you go. I mean, the feelings, has been for me about feelings, tears. I mean, and I've had them again and again as I listen to you, mixed with smiles and joy and sheer pleasure and absolute embarrassment in Gjovalin's before and after, my God. Really, feelings of gratitude to all of you, my former students. I can't call you students. I mean, you're super hyper grown up, but you came from afar, both in time and space, as we started this morning, to utter all this undeserved praise. And also thank you to my dear colleague, Tim, Hartmut, Richard, of course, to Julie and Radistan and Olivier, beyond the call of duty, that you've been able to come here and so brilliantly spoken about your, high, how it feels when you're high on drugs. I shouldn't have said that. There are also feelings of atonement. I have to admit, I really apologize now and today in public for all the hard time I gave you. Matt, sorry for shredding to piece your non-argument at six weeks before. And I'm sure this has echoed in others too. So there is also the feeling of pure nostalgia, but not any nostalgia, a future expanding nostalgia, really, and I say this because this has reconciled me with these terrible moments I lived through a few weeks ago. I came here for Tim's wonderful liberalism conference, and I had to empty my damn office. Now, if most of you in this room have spent many hours in this office, you can really, sympathize, right? And I kept on thinking and feeling in that moment, emptying my office. Who was it? It was who spoke about, and it was Demos emptying that office before. So imagine. There was the Harvard corner, the 90s, the 2000s, and I called it the graveyard of my past futures. All the past futures that never happened. All of these projects that never, and you will see when you get very old like me, how you will have graveyards of your past futures. But today, somehow, many of these past futures have been resurrected. Thanks to you, thanks to our journey. And whether it's how the Constitutional Convention 20 years later, Simone and Lars, is still with us, or the advice of the wise persons, or the Renew and Nora, Toby, Yuri, and our trade ethics, Matt, and all of that, and all our CSOX adventure, and the iterations of the Darndorf program. So yes, indeed, I'm not really leaving Oxford, I'm learning in the back. You know that very well, but these are stories that will continue. So it's a forward-looking, future-looking kind of story. And Also, I'm talking about feelings still really, really overwhelmingly. Someone talked about godmother. I don't know about that, but at least feelings of pride. Really such strong pride. I mean, pride of how, better than me, my ambition has always been, as you know, to be a critical theorist, to connect our analysis of the present with finding the seeds in the present that still gives us reasons for hope. That is the silver lining. It is otherwise known as immanent critique. I have done it badly, but you guys have done it beautifully, connecting the normative and the analytical, and hope in all of these cycles of dark and lightness that the European condition has offered back. And in this spirit, how you have never, thank goodness, just listened to me as if I was some sort of authority. Not really, not at all. It's always you who've challenged me, not so much me that have challenged you. And you've done it again today. And be careful, I have many stories myself, but then wait for the attacks. But really, everyone, you've heard, Kira Dimo Yuri on centering and the others' gaze and the iteration on this story. Yuri, I mean, you were mine today on democracy because you have the Rawlsian vision of a world that transcends sometimes democracy in various ways. Gjovalin against the utopia, and Matt, well, you went back to your amazing intuition in your thesis on all the different forms of powers that we find in Europe. And indeed today, we're perhaps in the 21st century, our European condition is the public versus private, is these corporations. We should never forget that is the great struggle coming up much more than between countries. So that leads me to, the second part of what I wanted to say is, of course, we can't sum up all these conversations. I did, but I have to say that my original hope, we were one beyond it. When I wrote to kind of frame our conversation today, the hope is that we can engage in scrutinizing our concern, our shared concern for human betterment and transformative potential in the European and global context. And in doing so, wonder whether conversations we had 20 or 10 years ago are still relevant. How do we productively engage in immanent critique to connect positive, normative, and prescriptive takes? And what difference can damn scholarship make? And indeed, I think that, there are many questions I hope some people might be still inspired with in the program, because I just sat late at night and wrote all of the questions I very unfairly wanted to throw at you, and you've picked up those and so many others that will stay with them, Matt, in a kind of mind map. And I really do believe that all the conversations we've had today, fascinating conversations, do justice to the laboratory metaphor. And I think Olivier picked up on the fact that, yes, yes, a laboratory means that Europe, but also the world, fails more often in its attempt to transform itself than it succeeds. And the only key is to learn from failure. And then maybe we can say something arrogant about, well, at least we tried to learn, we in this room, but who listens? And maybe, we need to listen to the world. I hope the world listens and will listen to you. There was much talk about hypocrisy, and even Gjovalin's, sunset from hypocrisy. And indeed, that's what I always wanted to highlight in talking about denials of recognition. That's what the European project is based on, not just a wartime, but a century's time of denying others in our midst, in the world. And that's upon what we try to build. So the remedy of mutual recognition comes from the original sin. We killed each other after World War II. 10 million people were killed after 45 among neighbors in Europe. So for me, the first way in which Europe can be a laboratory, planetary politics, is whether we can, from these denials of recognition, enter a world of recognition. Recognition of the global South's aspiration in terms of power, interest, sheer decent living. How do we do that? And I have two students, Iswea and Flo, who aren't here today. We talked a lot for years about recognition and denial in the nuclear era, which is so important as we talk about nuclear politics. and about, agonistic universalism, to quote Kira. And so my take, I have to say on this one, my most recent take, simply to echo authors on mythology, is to ask ourselves to be inspired by not Christian Europe, which above all is a denial of recognition, the Christian tradition, not Christian Europe, but Cretan Europe. And Cretan Europe, she's a refugee in chief, Gjovalin. Your passion was so well taken. She came from Lebanon and from out there, and she came, on the flood. She almost drowned many, many times because Zeus wasn't that careful. She landed at the periphery of Europe and trying to reinvent ourselves. She is made of all our others. She is not, quote, European. So I published this little playful piece on Cretan Europe versus Christian Europe and that was a pretext to quote, the new European Review of Books. If anyone hasn't heard of the new European Review of Books, I'm one of the great sponsors, so I couldn't avoid but cite it here. Read it, they're on their 3rd volume. It's an amazing group of friends from Amsterdam. So that was the first thread, planetary politics, the politics of the denial and recovery and promise of recognition. The third is that the second thread, we have just spent a lot of time on it, is whether as Eurocentric Europeans we can ever really decenter. And thank God we're all so skeptical. You've been brilliantly skeptical around this table about this. But I can't help but, just recall a bit of the silver lining. Simply that, I think that liberal hypocrisy, absolutely to echo Kira, is not a bad thing. It's always about how, as liberals, we have aspirations. In our lives, we have aspirations. We can't get to them because we die way too quickly, but we can't live without them either. So to start with, Judith Schlar praised liberal hypocrisy, because indeed it's what makes us thrive always. And it's that utopia which Ricoeur, and I don't cite Ricoeur because Macron pretends to cite him, but simply because let's remember that for Ricoeur, we have two great pathologies in our polities. One is utopia and the other is ideologies. But Ricoeur didn't stop there. He said to us, all we need to do is somehow deal with the pathologies of utopia and ideologies. They give us ways of envisaging the future. We need to live with them and deal with these pathologies through, at the end of the day, how do we transcend the pathology of utopia and ideology? Through the power of imagination. And that is, in part, how we transcend imagining the suffering of others. Indeed, our refugees in chief and unknown, but also imagining these horizons that Olivier sees from outer space. Indeed, how do we imagine modernity as a co-creation, as Europeans who have taken ownership of it? And how do we imagine a true post-imperial era for Europe? That is really what we've talked so much about. And that leads me to the third thread. That is that, what is planetary politics? It's about, at the end of the day, a real sustainable now, taking into account that it is urgent to act long-term, and that the EU's reckoning with its capacity to act very recently has become much more loyal to that aspiration for the long term, to decolonizing the future that we have colonized of our children. This was really Matt's message with his multiple temporality, because the temporality indeed take us from legacy to forecasting to imagining the worst and the best. And so for me, this is where I have moved increasingly in my, as an academic, with my students, is to pull, and Kira remembers how we started on this journey together. But I do it a lot at UI, indeed through plays, through art, and Olivier, we were there. But it's also really about how do we imagine slow governance, just like we have slow food in Italy. How do we slow ourselves down? How do we mindfully be our part of the world? All of this is about slowness to get there. So when we talk about planetary politics and greenwashing, it is about a different relationship to time and a pivot of our governance from the politics of space and exclusion to the politics of time and inclusion. And the necessary conditions for that have been talked about a lot today. And indeed, Tocqueville would have said, if we think about a democratic world, a better world, we need to talk about economic underpinnings. And I'm glad it came back by the end of our conversation. How Matt picked up on trade ethics, but Eilish started us. And I learned that, and there's so many surprises today. But remember how Eilish talked about how we talked about trade 25 years ago, but now she's doing it as ambassador there in Brussels, thinking about how we can have citizens' assembly and inclusiveness in making trade policy. Similarly, Matt, you talked about how we can push back again extractive. You said extractive data politics, but extractive capitalism. Well, this is what it's going to take, thinking long term, because capitalism, the end of capitalism, won't arrive before the end of the world. We know that. So how do we deal with this in time? And indeed, Olivier, this anti-anthropomorphic Anthropocene that you're pulling from. And this finally leads me to my fourth thread, and indeed the thread that I'm most involved in today when we talk about planetary politics. Yes, many of you alluded to European democracy. For 20 years, you've heard me and discussed with me, what this means to think about democracy, probably to echo Matt's right to protest, and also the universal and the particular conversation we had. For me, democracy is the palimpsest, the accumulation of our memory of all the struggles that have gone before us and outside us, and bringing all of them in us, and all the struggles to come. And these particular, yes, there are particular struggles, but they do have a universal cause. And that cause is the capture of the state, capture of power, capture of corporation by the few on behalf of the many. And through that, the exercise of arbitrary power. And that's what they live through in Hong Kong. That's what they live through in around the world. That's what they live through increasingly in many pockets of Europe too. The peoples of Europe. So how to push back against it is to be together in how do you internalize this struggle, and governing together, being in togetherness, but not as one, is the ideal of democracy. This is, of course, about plurality, and many of you spoke about this plurality in brilliant terms, but it is moreover beyond plurality, the horizontal intermingling, the intermingling between people's memories, desires, fears, all of this plurality brought into a sense of governing together, or shared leadership, Simone. And when we speak about Europe and the European condition, we see a polity that is increasingly bringing powers up. The countervailing desire and impulse that has to accompany bringing powers up is to bring power, not powers, but power down, all the way to the people. And that's the only way you can intermingle, which is why, indeed, my projects these days is what are the multiple ways in which we do that? So Gjovalin, yes, we live in a world of hardcore power politics, the return of geopolitics, but the response of Olivier is my response too. How do we fashion a democratic geopolitics? It's not beyond our capacity to think about the way in which Europe can be empowered in the world if it becomes citizen power Europe. It's not there yet, because yes, we have a third democratic transformation that is happening before our eyes. After Athens, after parliaments, we have global, transnational, transmodal, translational democratic politics, but it's not done by states, it's done by people around the world. How does Europe pay homage and become part of that? That's the challenge of Citizen Power Europe, and one of the key to the geopolitical game. And you only do this indeed by reversing the gaze. And I am listing these things because we have projects, I have projects, they link to Darendorf, they link to UI, they link to Oxford. So anyone who's interested, please be with me. We are building a huge roadmap because so much exciting, difficult, frustrating democratic innovations are happening around the world that Europe better be inspired with. And this is an impossible challenge because if you say that in Brussels, they say, really? What can we learn from the Indias and the South Africa and the Brazils of this world? So that is one big, big challenge. So to finish then, and promise, Richard, I'm coming to the end. I have embarked with many friends and some of you in a democratic odyssey where we will build in Europe a Euro-wide transnational citizen assembly that will rotate around Europe. It'll be combined with the arts in many different ways. It's super exciting. And it will include a flotilla that will go from Venice to Athens. I promise you. So I'm trying to attract this democratic odyssey of mine. So let me end after this excitement of the odyssey, coming back to feelings, because I was thinking of us today, and I remember Kira appealing to our dear Hannah Arendt. And when you all know how Hannah Arendt asked so cogently, so urgently, why do we succumb to evil and make it banal? Well, why do we let people drown in the Mediterranean Sea? And you know how she argued that the root of tyranny was the act of making other humans irrelevant. And we know that if there's something that defines the world today, to some extent, it is all these big, strong men who are very, very busy making other humans irrelevant, but also all our ordinary citizens, so-called, doing the same thing. So why did Hannah Arendt, when we feel that she's so right, so cogently and terribly right, why can she spell hope for us? Now remember what she argued was the antidote of all of this evil, which resides in making other humans irrelevant. You remember what the antidote is? Are you saying, Liz, amor mundi? Oh, that's not what you're saying, but it could be. Really, there's nothing else. All you concert.
Action in concert.
Concert will not happen without amor of your neighbor and amor of the world. Amor mundi. So this is what I want to say to you, my dear friends, my dear former students. Well, you know, I love you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, and now for the party. And I also want to say, you're all, if someone hasn't received the invitation to our party in our garden tomorrow, Simon and I will turn this party from 4 to 10 tomorrow. So please be there, or let me know if you haven't received the party. And now it's the first party in our garden, right?
Can we make a picture?
Yes, let's make a group picture outside.
Because I didn't thought you might like a water bottle for the next week. Seriously, whatever. For some reason, yeah, and this is by partner, right?
You have to go. You have to go out from the. Family fund. Very odd. We only have to get it.
There may be different ways anyways.
The bus goes as far as where. FDI and often. I'll send you the message. I want to walk the bus either. No, I'm perfectly fine. Okay. It would be nice.
No, but we can't do it without you. On peut t'aider, mon chéri? C'est bon? I'm going to take my camera.
Calypso, you said the freak, and you know, you're also a Brit, and I'm a Brit.
Freakish. I'm British.
Well, I'm Brit.
It's there is one of the idea but again with the knowledge of your skeptical parties and producing the environment, they're not potentially found as they all part of the whole
Maintain those views, but they need to go out for the family. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you see a
It was somewhere near us.
Did you see one? No.
No,
Did it this maybe?
probably this one.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I missed it.
You need to sign, you need to sign it over. Okay, yeah.
Hop over to the other.
The song was fantastic. I'm ending the recording, okay?